Section 1 of The Last of the Valerii. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas Clifford. The Last of the Valerii by Henry James. Section 1. I had had occasion to declare more than once that if my goddaughter married a foreigner, I should refuse to give her away. And yet when the young Conte Valerio was presented to me in Rome as her accepted and plighted lover, I found myself looking at the happy fellow, after a momentary stare of amazement, with a certain paternal benevolence, thinking, indeed, that from the pictorial point of view, she with her yellow locks and he with his dusky ones, they were a strikingly well-assorted pair. She brought him up to me, half proudly, half timidly, pushing him before her and begging me with one of her dove-like glances to be very polite. I don't know that I usually miss that effect, but she was so deeply impressed with his grandeur that she thought it impossible to do him honour enough. The Conte Valerio's grandeur was doubtless nothing for a young American girl, who had the air and almost the habits of a princess, to sound her trumpet about. But she was desperately in love with him, and not only her heart but her imagination was touched. He was extremely handsome, and with a beauty which was less a matter of mere fortunate surface than usually happens in the handsome Roman race. There was a latent tenderness in his admirable mask, and his grave, slow smile, if it suggested no great nimbleness of wit, spoke of a manly constancy which promised well for Martha's happiness. He had little of the light, inexpensive urbanity of his countrymen, and there was a kind of a stupid sincerity in his gaze. It seemed to suspend response until he was sure he understood you. He was certainly a little dense, and I fancied that to a political or aesthetic question the reply would be particularly slow. He is good and strong and brave, the young girl, however, assured me, and I easily believed her. Strong the Conte Valerio certainly was. He had a head and a throat like some of the busts in the Vatican. To my eye, which has looked at things now so long with the painter's purpose, it was a real annoyance to see such a throat rising out of the white cravat of the period. It sustained a head as massively round as that of the familiar bust of the Emperor Caracalla, and covered with the same dense sculptural crop of curls. The young man's hair grew superbly. It was such hair as the old Romans must have had when they walked bareheaded and bronzed about the world. It made a perfect arch over his low, clear forehead, and prolonged itself on cheek and chin in a close, crisp beard, strong with its own strength and unstiffened by the razor. Neither his nose nor his mouth was delicate, but they were powerful, shapely, masculine. His complexion was of a deep glowing brown, which no emotion would alter, and his large lucid eyes seemed to stare at you like a pair of polished agates. He was of middle stature, and his chest was of so generous a girth that you half expected to hear his linen crack with its even respirations. And yet, with his simple human smile, he looked neither like a young bullock nor a gladiator. His powerful voice was the least bit harsh, and his large ceremonious reply to my compliment had the massive sonority with which civil speeches must have been uttered in the age of Augustus. I had always considered my goddaughter a very American little person in all honourable meanings of the word, and I doubted if this sturdy young Latin would understand the transatlantic element in her nature. But evidently he would make her a loyal and ardent lover. She seemed to me, in her tinted prettiness, so tender, so appealing, so bewitching, that it was impossible to believe that he had not more thoughts for all this than for the equally pretty fortune which it yet bothered me to believe that he must, like a good Italian, have taken the exact measure of. His own worldly goods consisted of the paternal estate, a villa within the walls of Rome, which his scanty funds had suffered to fall into sombre disrepair. "It's the villa she's in love with quite as much as the Count," said her mother. "She dreams of converting the Count, that's all very well, but she dreams of refurnishing the villa." The upholsterers were turned into it, I believe, before the wedding, and there was a great scrubbing and sweeping of saloons, and raking and weeding of alleys and avenues. Martha made frequent visits of inspection while these ceremonies were taking place, but one day, on her return, she came into my little studio with an air of amusing horror. She had found them scraping the sarcophagus in the great ilex walk, divesting it of its mossy coat, disencrusting it of the sacred green mould of the ages. This was their idea of making the villa comfortable. She had made them transport it to the dampest place they could find, for, next after that slow-coming, slow-going smile of her lover, it was the rusty complexion of his patrimonial marbles that she most prized. The young Count's conversion proceeded less rapidly, and indeed I believe that his betrothed brought little zeal to the affair. She loved him so devoutly that she believed no change of faith could better him, and she would have been willing for his sake to say her prayers to the sacred Bambino at the feast of the Epiphany. But he had the good taste to demand no such sacrifice, and I was struck with the happy significance of a scene of which I was an accidental observer. It was at St. Peter's one Friday afternoon, during the vesper service which takes place in the chapel of the choir. I met my goddaughter, wandering serenely on her lover's arm, her mother being established on her camp stool near the entrance of the place. The crowd was collected thereabouts, and the body of the church was empty. Now and then the high voices of the singers escaped into the outer vastness and melted slowly away in the incense-thickened air. Something in the young girl's step and the clasp of her arm in her lover's told me that her contentment was perfect. As she threw back her head and gazed into the magnificent immensity of vault and dome, I felt that she was in that enviable mood in which all consciousness revolves on a single centre, and that her sense of the splendours around her was one with the ecstasy of her trust. They stopped before that sombre group of polyglot confessionals, which proclaimed so portentously the sinfulness of the world, and Martha seemed to make some almost passionate protestation. A few minutes later I overtook them. "Don't you agree with me, dear friend," said the Count, who always addressed me with the most affectionate deference, "that before I marry so pure and sweet a creature as this, I ought to go into one of those places and confess every sin I ever was guilty of, every evil thought and impulse and desire of my grossly evil nature?" Martha looked at him, half in deprecation, half in homage, with an eye which seemed at once to insist that her lover could have no vices, and to plead that if he had, there would be something magnificent in them. "Listen to him," she said, smiling. "The list would be long, and if you waited to finish it, you would be late for the wedding. But if you confess your sins for me, it's only fair I should confess mine for you. Do you know what I have been saying to Marco?" she added, turning to me with the half-filial confidence she had always shown me, and with a rosy glow in her cheeks. "That I want to do something more for him than girls commonly do for their intended. To take some great step, to run some risk, to break some law even. I am quite willing to change my religion if he bids me. There are moments when I am terribly tired of simply staring at Catholicism. It will be a relief to come into a church to kneel. That, after all, is what they are meant for. Therefore, Marco mio, if it casts a shade across your heart to think that I'm a heretic, I will go and kneel down to that good old priest who has just entered the confessional yonder, and say to him, 'My father, I repent, I abjure, I believe. Baptize me in the only faith.'" "If it's as a compliment to the Count," I said, "it seems to me he ought to anticipate it by giving up for you something equally important." She had spoken lightly and with a smile, and yet with an undertone of girlish ardour. The young man looked at her with a solemn, puzzled face, and shook his head. "Keep your religion," he said, "every one his own. If you should attempt to embrace mine, I am afraid you would close your arms about a shadow. I am not a good Catholic, a good Christian. I don't understand all these chants and ceremonies and splendours. When I was a child I never could learn my catechism. My poor old confessor long ago gave me up. He told me I was a good boy, but a pagan. You must not be more devout than your husband. I don't understand your religion any better, but I beg you not to change it for mine. If it has helped to make you what you are, it must be good." And taking the young girl's hand, he was about to raise it affectionately to his lips, But suddenly remembering that they were in a place unaccordant with profane passions, he lowered it with a comical smile. "Let us go," he murmured, passing his hand over his forehead. "This heavy atmosphere of St. Peter's always stupefies me." They were married in the month of May, and we separated for the summer, the Contessa's mamma going to illuminate the domestic circle beyond the sea with her reflected dignity. When I returned to Rome in the autumn, I found the young couple established at the Villa Valerio, which was now partly reclaimed from its antique decay. I begged that the hand of improvement might be lightly laid on it, for as an unscrupulous old painter of ruins and relics, with an eye to "subjects," I preferred that crumbling things should be allowed to crumble at their ease. My goddaughter was quite of my way of thinking. She had a high appreciation of antiquity. Advising with me often as to projected changes, she was sometimes more conservative even than I, and I more than once smiled at her archaeological zeal, declaring that I believed she had married the Count because he was like a statue of the decadence. I had a constant invitation to spend my days at the villa, and my easel was always planted in one of the garden walks. I grew to have a painter's passion for the place, and to be intimate with every tangled shrub and twisted tree, every moss-coated vase and mouldy sarcophagus, and sad disfeatured bust of those grim old Romans who could so ill afford to become more meagre-visaged. The place was of small extent, but though there were many other villas more pretentious and splendid, none seemed to me more exquisitely romantic, more haunted by the ghosts of the past. There were memories in the fragrance of the untended flowers, in the hum of the insects. It contained, among other idle, untrimmed apartments, an old ilex walk, in which I used religiously to spend half an hour every day, half an hour being, I confess, just as long as I could stay without beginning to sneeze. The trees arched and intertwisted over the dusky vista in the most perfect symmetry, and as it was exposed uninterruptedly to the west, the low evening sun used to transfuse it with a sort of golden mist and play through it, over leaves and knotty boughs and mossy marbles, with 1,000 crimson fingers. It was filled with disinterred fragments of sculpture, nameless statues and noseless heads, and rough-hewn sarcophagi, which made it deliciously solemn. The statues used to stand in the perpetual twilight like conscious things, brooding on their long observations. I used to linger near them, half expecting they would speak and tell me their stony secrets, whisper hoarsely the whereabouts of their mouldering fellows, still unrecovered from the soil. My goddaughter was idyllically happy and absolutely in love. I was obliged to confess that even rigid rules have their exceptions, and that now and then an Italian count is as genuine as possible. Marco was a perfect original, not a copy, and seemed quite content to be appreciated. Their life was a childlike interchange of caresses, as candid and natural as those of a shepherd and shepherdess in a bucolic poem. To stroll in the ilex walk, and feel her husband's arm around her waist and his shoulder against her cheek, to roll cigarettes for him while he puffed them in the great marble-paved rotunda in the centre of the house, to fill his glass from an old rusty red amphora, these graceful occupations satisfied the young countess. She rode with them sometimes in the grassy shadow of aqueducts and tombs, and sometimes suffered him to show his beautiful wife at Roman dinners and balls. She played dominoes with him after dinner, and carried out, in a desultory way, a scheme of reading him the daily papers. This observance was subject to fluctuations caused by the Count's invincible tendency to go to sleep, a failing his wife never attempted to disguise or palliate. She would sit and brush the flies from him while he lay statuesquely snoring, and if I ventured near him, would place her finger on her lips and whisper that she thought her husband was as handsome asleep as awake. I confess I often felt tempted to reply that he was at least quite as entertaining, for the young man's happiness had not multiplied the topics on which he readily conversed. He had plenty of good sense, and his opinion on any practical matter was usually worth having. He would often come and sit near me while I worked at my easel, and offer a friendly criticism on what I was doing. His taste was a little crude, but his eye was excellent, and his measurement of the correspondence between some feature of my sketch and the object I was trying to reproduce as trustworthy as that of a mathematical instrument. But he seemed to me to have either a strange reserve or a still stranger simplicity, to be fundamentally unfurnished with anything remotely resembling an idea. He had no beliefs, nor hopes, nor fears, nothing but senses, appetites, serenely luxurious tastes. As I watched him strolling about while he looked at his fingernails, I often wondered whether he had anything that could properly be termed a soul, and whether good health and good nature were not the sum total of his advantages. "It's lucky he's good-natured," I used to say to myself, "for if he were not, there is nothing in his conscience to keep him in order. If he had irritable nerves instead of quiet ones, he would strangle us as the infant Hercules strangled the poor little snakes. He's the natural man. Happily his nature is gentle. I can mix my colours at my ease." I wondered what he thought about, and what passed through his mind in the sunny idleness that seemed to shut him in from the modern workaday world, of which, in spite of my passion for bedaubing old panels with ineffective portraiture of mouldy statues against screens of box, I still flattered myself I was a member. I went so far as to believe that he sometimes withdrew from the world altogether. He had moods in which his consciousness seemed so remote, and his mind so irresponsive and inarticulate, that nothing but some fresh endearment or some sudden violence could have power to arouse him. Even his tenderness for his wife had a quality which made me uneasy. Whether or no he had a soul himself, he seemed not to suspect that she had one. I took a godfatherly interest in the development of her immortal part. I fondly believed her to be a creature susceptible of a moral life. But what was becoming of her moral life in this interminable heathenish honeymoon? Some fine day she would find herself tired of the Count's beaux yeux and make an appeal to his mind. She had, to my knowledge, plans of study, of charity, of worthily playing her part as a Contessa Valerio, a position as to which the family records furnished the most inspiring examples. But if the Count found the newspapers soporific, I doubted whether he would turn Dante's pages very fast for his wife, or smile with much zest at the anecdotes of Vasari. How could he advise her, instruct her, sustain her? And if she should become a mother, how could he share her responsibilities? He doubtless would transmit his little son and heir a stout pair of arms and legs, and a magnificent crop of curls, and sometimes remove his cigarette to kiss a dimpled spot. But I found it hard to picture him lending his voice to teach the lusty urchin his alphabet or his prayers, or the rudiments of infant virtue. One accomplishment indeed the Count possessed, which would make him an agreeable playfellow. He carried in his pocket a collection of precious fragments of antique pavement, bits of porphyry and malachite and lapis and basalt, disinterred on his own soil and brilliantly polished by use. With these you might see him occupied by the half hour, playing the simple game of catch and toss, ranging them in a circle, tossing them in rotation, catching them on the back of his hand. His skill was remarkable. He would send a stone 5 feet into the air, and pitch and catch and transpose the rest before he received it again. I watched with affectionate jealousy for the signs of a dawning sense on Martha's part that she was the least bit oddly mated. Once or twice, as the weeks went by, I fancied I read them, and that she looked at me with eyes which seemed to remember certain old talks of mine in which I had declared, with such verity as you please, that a Frenchman, an Italian, a Spaniard, might be a very good fellow, but that he never really respected the woman he pretended to love. For the most part, however, my alarms, suspicions, prejudices, spent themselves easily in the charmed atmosphere of our romantic, our classical home. We were out of the modern world, and had no business with modern scruples. The place was so bright, so still, so sacred to the silent, imperturbable past, that drowsy contentment seemed a natural law, and sometimes, when as I sat down at my work, I saw my companions passing arm in arm across the end of one of the long drawn vistas, and turning back to my palette, found my colours dimmer for the radiant vision. I could easily have believed that I was some old monkish chronicler or copyist engaged in illuminating a mediaeval legend. It was a help to ungrudging feelings that the Count, yielding to his wife's urgency, had undertaken a series of systematic excavations. To excavate is an expensive luxury, and neither Marco nor his latter forefathers had possessed the means for a disinterested pursuit of archaeology. But his young wife had persuaded herself that the much-trodden soil of the villa was as full of buried treasures as a bride cake of plums, and that it would be a pretty compliment to the ancient house which had accepted her as mistress to devote a portion of her dowry to bringing its mouldy honours to the light. I think she was not without a fancy that this liberal process would help to disinfect her Yankee dollars of the impertinent odour of trade. She took learned advice on the subject, and was soon ready to swear to you, proceeding from irrefutable premises, that a colossal gilt bronze Minerva mentioned by Strabo was placidly awaiting resurrection at a point 20 rods from the northwest angle of the house. She had a couple of asthmatic old antiquaries to lunch, whom, having plied with unwonted potations, she walked off their legs in the grounds, and though they agreed on nothing else in the world, they individually assured her that researches properly conducted would probably yield an unequalled harvest of discoveries. The Count had been not only indifferent, but even unfriendly to the scheme, and had more than once arrested his wife's complacent allusions to it by an unaccustomed acerbity of tone. Let them lie, the poor disinherited gods, the Minerva, the Apollo, the Ceres you are so sure of finding, he said, and don't break their rest. What do you want of them? We can't worship them. Would you put them on pedestals to stare and mock at them? If you can't believe in them, don't disturb them. Peace be with them. I remember being a good deal impressed by a confession drawn from him by his wife's playfully declaring, in answer to some remonstrances in this strain, that he was really and truly superstitious. "Yes, by Bacchus, I am superstitious," he cried, "too much so perhaps. But I'm an old Italian, and you must take me as you find me. There have been things seen and done here which leave strange influences behind. They don't touch you, doubtless, who come of another race. But me they touch often, in the whisper of the leaves and the odour of the mouldy soil and the blank eyes of the old statues. I can't bear to look the statues in the face. I seem to see other strange eyes in the empty sockets, and I hardly know what they say to me. I call the poor old statues ghosts. In conscience, we have enough on the place already, lurking and peering in every shady nook. Don't dig up any more, or I won't answer for my wits." This account of Marco's sensibilities was too fantastic not to seem to his wife almost a joke, and though I imagined there was more in it, he made a joke so seldom that I should have been sorry to convert the poor girl's smile into a suspicion. With her smile she carried her point, and in a few days arrived a kind of an archaeological expert, or commissioner, with a dozen workmen who bristled with pickaxes and spades. For myself, I was secretly vexed at these energetic measures, for, though fond of disinterred statues, I disliked to see the soil disturbed, and deplored the profane sounds which were henceforth to jar upon the sleepy stillness of the gardens. I especially objected to the personage who conducted the operations, a little ugly dwarfish man, who seemed altogether a subterranean genius, an earthy gnome of the underworld, and went prying about the grounds with a malicious smile which suggested more delight in the money the Signor Conte was going to bury than in the expected marbles and bronzes. When the first sod had been turned, the Count's mood seemed to change very much, and his curiosity got the better of his scruples. He sniffed delightedly the odour of the humid earth, and stood watching the workmen as they struck constantly deeper, with a kindling wonder in his eyes. Whenever a pickaxe rang against a stone, he would utter a sharp cry, and be deterred from jumping into the trench only by some assurance on the part of the little expert that it was a false alarm. The near prospect of discovery seemed to act upon his nerves, and I met him more than once strolling restlessly among his cedarn alleys, as if at last he too had learned how to reflect. He took me by the arm and made me walk with him, having much to say about the chance of a "find." I rather wondered at his sudden eagerness, and asked myself whether he had an eye to the past or to the future, to the intrinsic interest of possible Minervas and Apollos, or to their market value. Whenever the Count came down to the place, and, as he very often did, began to berate his little army of spadesmen for dawdling, the diminutive person who superintended the operations would glance at me with a sarcastic twinkle which seemed to hint that excavations were sometimes a snare. We were kept a good while in suspense, for several false beginnings were made, the earth probed in the wrong places. The Count was discouraged. The resumption of his naps testified to it. But the master digger, who had his own ideas, shrewdly continued his labours, and as I sat at my easel I heard the spades making their gay sound as they touched the dislodged stones. Now and then I would pause, with an uncontrollable acceleration of my heartbeats. It may be, I would say, that some marble masterpiece is stirring there beneath its lightning weight of earth. There are as good fish in the sea as ever were caught. What if I should be summoned to welcome another Antinous back to fame, a Venus, a Faun, an Augustus? One morning it seemed to me that I had been hearing for half an hour a livelier movement of voices than usual, but as I was preoccupied with a puzzling bit of work, I made no enquiries. Suddenly a shadow fell across my canvas, and I turned round. The little excavator stood beside me, with a glittering eye, cap in hand, his forehead bathed in perspiration. Resting in the hollow of his arm was an earth-stained fragment of marble. In answer to my questioning glance he held it up to me, and I saw it was a woman's shapely hand. "Come," he simply said, and led the way to the excavation. The workmen were so closely gathered around the open trench that I saw nothing till he made them divide. Then, full in the sun, and flashing it back, almost, in spite of her dusky incrustations, I beheld, propped up with stones against a heap of earth, a majestic marble image. She seemed to me almost colossal, though I afterwards perceived that she was only of the proportions of a woman exceptionally tall. My pulses began to throb, for I felt that she was something great, and it was a high privilege to be among the first to know her. Her finished beauty gave her an almost human look, and her absent eyes seemed to wonder back at us. She was amply draped, so that I saw she was not a Venus. "She's a Juno," said the expert decisively, and she seemed indeed an embodiment of celestial supremacy and repose. Her beautiful head, bound with a single band, could have bent only to give the nod of command. Her eyes looked straight before her mouth was implacably grave. One hand, outstretched, appeared to have held a kind of imperial wand. The arm from which the other had been broken hung at her side with the most queenly majesty. The workmanship was of the greatest delicacy, and though perhaps there was more in her than usual of a certain personal expression, she was wrought as a whole in the large and simple manner of the great Greek period. She was a masterpiece of skill and a marvel of preservation. "Does the Count know?" I soon asked, for I had a guilty sense that our eyes were taking something from her. "The Signor Conte is at his siesta," said the padrone with his sceptical grin. "We don't like to disturb him." "Here he comes!" cried one of the workmen, and we promptly made way for him. His siesta had evidently been suddenly broken, for his face was flushed and his hair disordered. "Ah, my dream was right then!" he cried, and stood staring at the image. "What was your dream?" I asked, as his face seemed to betray more dismay than delight. "That they had found a wonderful Juno, and that she rose and came and laid her marble hand on mine. Is that it?" said the Count excitedly. An awestruck "Santissima Vergine" burst from one of the listening workmen. "Yes, Signor Conte, this is the hand," said the superintendent, holding up his perfect fragment. "I have had it safe here this half hour, so it can't have touched you." "But you are apparently right as to her being a Juno," I said. "Admire her at your leisure." And I turned away, for if the Count was superstitious, I didn't wish to embarrass by my observation. I repaired to the house to carry the news to my goddaughter, whom I found slumbering, dreamlessly it appeared, over a great archaeological octavo. "They have touched bottom," I said. "They have found something Phidian or Praxitelian at the very least." She dropped her octavo and rang for a parasol. I described the statue, but not graphically, I presume, for Martha gave a little sarcastic grimace. "A long fluted peplum," she said. "How very odd. I don't believe she's beautiful." "She's beautiful enough to make you jealous, figlioccia mia," I replied. We found the Count standing before the resurgent goddess in fixed contemplation, with folded arms. He seemed to have recovered from the impression of his dream, but I thought his face betrayed a still deeper emotion. He was pale, and gave no response as his wife affectionately clasped his arm. I am not sure, however, that his wife's attitude was not a livelier tribute to the perfection of the image. She had been laughing at my rhapsody as we walked from the house, and I had bethought myself of an assertion that I had somewhere seen, that women lack the perception of the purest beauty. Martha, however, seemed slowly to measure our Juno's infinite stateliness. She gazed a long time, silently, leaning against her husband, and then stepped, half timidly, down upon the stones which formed a rough base for the figure. She laid her two rosy, ungloved hands upon the stony fingers of the goddess, and remained for some moments pressing them in her warm grasp, and fixing her living eyes upon the sightless brow. When she turned round, her eyes were bright with the tear which deep admiration sometimes calls forth, and which in this case her husband was too much absorbed to notice. He had apparently given orders that the workmen should be treated to a cask of wine, in honour of their discovery. It was now brought and opened on the spot, and the little expert, having drawn the first glass, stepped forward hat in hand, and obsequiously presented it to the Countess. She only moistened her lips with it, and passed it to her husband. He raised it mechanically to his own, then suddenly he stopped, held it a moment aloft, and poured it out slowly and solemnly at the feet of the Juno. "Why, it's a libation!" I cried. He made no answer, and walked slowly away. There was no more work done that day. The labourers lay on the grass, gazing with the native Roman relish of a fine piece of sculpture, but wasting no wine in pagan ceremonies. In the evening the Count paid the Juno another visit, and gave orders that on the morrow she should be transferred to the Casino. The Casino was a deserted garden house, built in not ungraceful imitation of an Ionic temple, in which Marco's ancestors must often have assembled to drink cool syrups from Venetian glasses and listen to madrigals and other concetti. It contained several dusty fragments of antique sculptures, and it was spacious enough to enclose that richer collection of which I began fondly to regard the Juno as but the nucleus. Here, with short delay, this fine creature was placed, serenely upright, a reversed funereal cippus forming a sufficiently solid pedestal. The small superintendent, who seemed a thorough adept in all the offices of restoration, rubbed her and scraped her with mysterious art, removed her earthy stains, and gave her back the lustre of her beauty. Her firm, fine surface seemed to glow with a kind of renascent purity and bloom, and but for her broken hand you might have fancied she had just received the last stroke of the chisel. Her presence remained no secret. Within 2 or 3 days half a dozen inquisitive conoscenti posted out to obtain sight of her. I happened to be present when the first of these gentlemen, a German in blue spectacles, with a portfolio under his arm, presented himself at the villa. The Count, hearing his voice at the door, came forward and eyed him coldly from head to foot. "Your new Juno, Signor Conte," began the German, "is, in my opinion, much more likely to be a certain Persephone." "I have neither a Juno nor a Persephone to discuss with you," said the Count curtly. "You are misinformed." "You have dug up no statue?" cried the German. "What a scandalous hoax!" "None worthy of your learned attention. I am sorry you should have the trouble of carrying your little notebook so far." The Count had suddenly become witty. "But you have something, surely. The rumour is running through Rome." "The rumour be damned!" cried the Count savagely. "I have nothing. Do you understand? Be so good as to say so to your friends." The answer was explicit, and the poor archaeologist departed, tossing his flaxen mane. But I pitied him, and ventured to remonstrate with the Count. She might as well be still in the earth if no one is to see her, I said. I am to see her, that's enough, he answered with the same unnatural harshness. Then in a moment, as he caught me eyeing him askance in troubled surprise, I hated his great portfolio. He was going to make some hideous drawing of her. Ah, that touches me, I said. I too have been planning to make a little sketch. He was silent for some moments, after which he turned and grasped my arm with less irritation but with extraordinary gravity. Go in there towards twilight, he said, and sit for an hour and look at her. I think you will give up your sketch. If you don't, my good old friend, you are welcome. I followed his advice, and as a friend I gave up my sketch. But an artist is an artist, and I secretly longed to attempt one. Orders strictly in accordance with the Count's reply to our German friend were given to the servants, who, with an easy Italian conscience and a gracious Italian persuasiveness, assured all subsequent inquirers that they had been lamentably misinformed. I have no doubt, indeed, that in default of larger opportunity they made condolence remunerative. Further operations were for the present suspended, as implying an affront to the incomparable Juno. The workmen departed, but the little adept still haunted the premises, and sounded the soil for his own entertainment. One day he came to me with his usual ambiguous grimace. "The beautiful hand of the Juno," he murmured. "What has become of it?" "I have not seen it since you called me to look at her. I remembered that when I went away it was lying on the grass near the excavation." "Where I placed it myself. After that it disappeared. Pari impossibile." "Do you suspect one of your workmen? Such a fragment as that would bring more scudi than most of them ever looked at." "Some perhaps are greater thieves than the others, but if I were to call up the greatest rascal of the lot and accuse him, the Count would interfere." "He must value that beautiful hand, nevertheless." My friend, the resurrectionist, looked about him and winked. "He values it so much that he himself purloined it. That's my belief, and I think that the less we say about it, the better." "Purloined it, my dear sir? After all, it's his own property." "Not so much as that comes to. So beautiful a creature is more or less the property of every one. We have all a right to look at her. But the Count treats her as if she were a sacrosanct image of the Madonna. He keeps her under lock and key, and pays her solitary visits. What does he do, after all? When a beautiful woman is in stone, all one can do is to look at her. And what does he do with that precious hand? He keeps it in a silver box. He has made a relic of it." And this cynical personage began to chuckle grotesquely as he walked away. End of section 1 of The Last of the Valerii. Last of the Valerii. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last of the Valerii by Henry James, Section 2. He left me musing uncomfortably and wondering what the deuce he meant. The Count certainly chose to make a mystery of the Juno, but this seemed a natural incident of the first rapture of possession. I was willing to wait for permission to approach her, and in the meantime I was glad to find that there was a limit to his constitutional apathy. But as the days elapsed I began to be conscious that his enjoyment was not communicative, but strangely cold and shy and sombre. That he should admire a marble goddess was no reason for his despising mankind, yet he really seemed to be making invidious comparisons between us. From this ridiculous prescription his charming wife was not accepted. At moments when I tried to persuade myself that he was neither worse nor better company than usual, the expression of her face contradicted this superficial view. She said nothing, but she wore a look of really touching perplexity. She sat at times with her eyes fixed on him with a kind of imploring curiosity, as if for the present she were too much surprised to be angry. What passed between them in private, I had of course no warrant to inquire. Nothing, I suspected, and that was the misery. It was part of the misery, too, that he was impenetrable to these mute glances, and looked over her head with an air of superb abstraction. Occasionally he seemed to notice that I too didn't know what to make of his condition, and then for a moment his dull eye would sparkle, half, as it appeared, with a kind of sinister irony, and half with an impulse strangely stifled, as soon as he felt it, to justify himself. But from his wife he kept his face inexorably averted, and when she approached him with some melancholy attempt at fondness, he received it with an ill-concealed shudder. The situation struck me as tremendously queer, and I grew to hate the Count and everything that belonged to him. "I was 1,000 times right," I cried. "An Italian Count may be mighty fine, but he won't wear. Give us some wholesome young fellow of our own blood, who will play us none of these dusky old-world tricks. Artist as I have aspired to be, I will never again recommend a husband with traditions." I lost my pleasure in the villa, in the violet shadows and amber lights, the mossy marbles and the long trailing profile of the Alban hills. My painting stood still, everything looked ugly. I sat and fumbled with my palette, and seemed to be mixing mud with my colours. My head was stuffed with dismal thoughts, an intolerable weight settled itself on my heart. The poor Count became, to my imagination, a dark efflorescence of the evil germs which history had implanted in his line. No wonder he was foredoomed to be cruel. Was not cruelty a tradition in his race, and crime an example? The unholy passions of his forefathers revived, incurably, in his untaught nature, and clamoured dumbly for an issue. What a heavy heritage it seemed to me, as I reckoned it up in my melancholy musings, the Count's interminable ancestry! Back to the profligate revival of arts and vices, back to the bloody medley of medieval wars, back through the long fitfully glaring dusk of the early ages to its ponderous origin in the solid Roman state, back through all the darkness of history it stretched itself, losing every claim on my sympathies as it went. Such a record was in itself a curse, and my dear girl had expected it to sit as lightly and gratefully on her consciousness as her feathers on her hat. I have little idea how long this painful situation lasted. It seemed the longer from my goddaughter's persistent reticence and my inability to offer her a word of consolation. A sensitive woman, disappointed in marriage, exhausts her own ingenuity before she takes counsel of others. The Count's preoccupations, whatever they were, made him increasingly restless. He came and went at random with nervous abruptness. He took long rides alone, and, as I inferred, rarely went through the form of excusing himself to his wife. And still, as time went on, he came no nearer explaining his mystery. With the lapse of the months, however, I confess that my anxiety began to be tempered with compassion. If I had expected to see him propitiate his inexorable ancestry by the commission of a misdeed, now that his honest nature appeared to have refused them this satisfaction, I felt a sort of grudging gratitude. A man couldn't be so infernally blue without being, however little he might confess it, in want of sympathy. He had always treated me with that antique deference to a grizzled beard for which elderly men reserve the cream of their general tenderness for waning fashions, and I thought it possible he would suffer me at last to lay a healing hand upon his trouble. One evening, when I had taken leave of my goddaughter, and given her, in a silent kiss, my rather ineffectual blessing, I came out and found the Count sitting in the garden in the mild starlight, and staring at a mouldy Hermes planted in a clump of oleander. I sat down by him, and informed him in definite terms that his conduct required an explanation. He half turned his head, and his dark pupil gleamed an instant. "I understand," he said. "You think me crazy," and he tapped his forehead. "No, not crazy, but unhappy. And if unhappiness runs its course too freely, of course it's a great strain on the mind." He was silent a while, and then, "I am not unhappy," he cried abruptly. "I am tremendously happy. You wouldn't believe the satisfaction I take in sitting here and staring at that old weather-worn Hermes. Formerly I used to be afraid of him. His frown used to remind me of a bushy-browed old priest who taught me Latin and looked at me terribly over the book when I stumbled in my Virgil. But now it seems to me the friendliest, jolliest thing in the world, and suggests the most delightful images. He stood pouting his great lips in some old Roman's garden 2,000 years ago. He saw the sandaled feet treading the alleys, and the rose-crowned heads bending over the wine. He knew the old feasts and the old worship, the old believers and the old gods. As I sit here he speaks to me, in his own dumb way, and describes it all. No, no, my friend, I am the happiest of men." I had denied that I thought he was crazy, but I suddenly began to suspect it, for I found nothing reassuring in this singular rhapsody. The Hermes, for a wonder, had kept his nose, and when I reflected that my dear Countess was being neglected for this senseless pagan block, I secretly promised myself to come the next day with a hammer and deal him such a lusty blow as would make him too ridiculous for a sentimental tête-à-tête. Meanwhile, however, the Count's infatuation was no laughing matter, and I expressed my sincerest conviction when I said, after a pause, that I should recommend him to see either a priest or a physician. He burst into uproarious laughter. "A priest! What should I do with a priest, or he with me? I never loved him, and I feel less like beginning than ever. A priest, my dear friend," he repeated, laying his hand on my arm. "Don't send a priest at me if you value his sanity. My confession would frighten the poor man out of his wits. As for a doctor, I never was better in my life. And unless," he added abruptly, rising and eyeing me askance, "you want to poison me in Christian charity, I advise you to leave me alone." Decidedly the Count was unsound, and I had no heart for some days to go back to the villa. How should I treat him? What stand should I take? What course did Martha's happiness and dignity demand? I wandered about Rome, turning over these questions, and one afternoon found myself in the Pantheon. A light spring shower had begun to fall, and I hurried for refuge into the big rotunda, which its Christian altars have but half converted into a church. No Roman monument retains a deeper impress of ancient life, or has more of the form of the antique faiths whose temples were nobler than their gods. The huge dusky dome seems to the spiritual ear to hold a vague reverberation of pagan worship, as a shell picked up on the beach holds the rumour of the sea. 3 or 4 persons were scattered before the various altars. Another stood near the centre, beneath the aperture in the dome. As I drew near, I perceived this was the Count. He was planted with his hands behind him, looking up first at the heavy rain clouds as they crossed the great bull's eye, and then down at the besprinkled circle on the pavement. In those days the pavement was rugged and cracked, and magnificently old, and this ample space, in a free communion with the weather, had become as mouldy and mossy and verdant as a strip of garden soil. A tender herbage had sprung up in the crevices of the slabs, and the little microscopic shoots were twinkling in the rain. This great weather current through the uncapped vault deadens effectively the customary odours of incense and tallow, and transports one to a faith that was on terms of reciprocity with nature. It seemed to have performed this office for the Count. His face wore an indefinable expression of ecstasy, and he was so wrapped in contemplation that it was some time before he noticed me. The sun was struggling through the clouds without, and yet a thin rain continued to fall, and came drifting down into our gloomy enclosure in a sort of illuminated drizzle. The Count watched it with the fascinated stare of a child watching a fountain, and then turned away, pressing his hand to his brow, and walked over to one of the rather perfunctory altars. Here he again stood staring, but in a moment wheeled about and returned to his former place. Just then he recognized me, and perceived, I suppose, the curious gaze I must have fixed on him. He waved me a greeting with his hand, and at last came towards me. He was in a state of nervous exaltation, doing his best to appear natural. "This is the best place in Rome," he murmured. "It's worth 50 St. Peters. But you know I never came here till the other day. I left it to the forestieri. They go about with their red books and their opera glasses, and read about this and that, and think they know it. Ah, you must feel it, feel the beauty and fitness of that great open skylight. Now only the wind and the rain, the sun and the cold, come down. But of old," and he touched my arm and gave me a strange smile, "the pagan gods and goddesses used to descend through it and take their places at their altars. What a procession when the eyes of faith could see it! Those are the things they have given us instead." And he gave a pitiful shrug. "I should like to pull down their pictures, overturn their candlesticks, and poison their holy water." "My dear Count," I said gently, "you should tolerate people's honest beliefs. Would you renew the Inquisition, and in the interests of Jupiter and Mercury?" "People wouldn't tolerate my belief if they guessed it," he cried. "There's been a great deal of talk about the pagan persecutions, but the Christians persecuted as well, and the old gods were worshipped in caves and woods as well as the new. And none the worse for that. It was in caves and woods and streams, in earth and air and water they dwelt. And there, and here too, in spite of all your Christian lustrations, a son of old Italy may find them still." He had said more than he meant, and his mask had fallen. I looked at him hard, and felt a sudden outgush of the compassion we always feel for a creature irresponsibly excited. I seemed to touch the source of his trouble, and my relief was great, for my discovery made me feel like bursting into laughter. But I contented myself with smiling benignantly. He looked back at me suspiciously, as if to judge how far he had betrayed himself, and in his glance I read somehow that he had a conscience we could take hold of. In my gratitude I was ready to thank any gods he pleased. Take care," I said. "You are saying things which, if the sacristan there were to hear and report—" and I passed my hand through his arm and led him away. I was startled and shocked, but I was also amused and comforted. The Count had suddenly become for me a delightfully curious phenomenon, and I passed the rest of the day in meditating on the strange ineffaceability of race characteristics. A sturdy young Latin I had called poor Marco, and he was sturdier indeed than I had dreamed him. Discretion was now out of place, and on the morrow I spoke to my goddaughter. She had lately been hoping, I think, that I would help her to unburden her heart, for she immediately gave way to tears, and confessed that she was miserable. I have racked my brain to discover what I had said, or done, or thought to displease him. And yet he goes about like a man too deeply injured to complain. He has never uttered a harsh word, or given me a reproachful look. He has simply renounced me. I have dropped out of his life." She spoke with such a pathetic little quiver in her voice that I was on the point of telling her that I had guessed the riddle, and that was half the battle. But I was afraid of her incredulity. My solution was so fantastic, so apparently far-fetched, so absurd, that I resolved to wait for convincing evidence. To obtain it I continued to watch the Count, covertly and cautiously, but with a vigilance which disinterested curiosity now made intensely keen. I returned to my painting, and neglected no pretext for hovering about the gardens in the neighbourhood of the Casino. The Count, I think, suspected my designs, or at least my suspicions, and would have been glad to remember just what he had suffered himself to say to me in the Pantheon. But it deepened my interest in his extraordinary situation that in so far as I could read his deeply brooding face, he seemed, half contemptuously, to have forgiven me. He gave me a glance occasionally as he passed me, in which a kind of dumb desire for help appeared to struggle with the conviction that such a one as I would never understand him. I was willing enough to help him, but the case was exceedingly delicate, and I wished to master the symptoms. Meanwhile I worked and waited and wondered. Ah, I wondered, you may be sure, with an interminable wonder, and turn it over as I would, I couldn't get used to my idea. Sometimes it offered itself to me with a perverse fascination which deprived me of all wish to interfere. The Count took the form of a precious psychological study, and refined feelings seemed to dictate a tender respect for his delusion. I envied him the force of his imagination, and I used sometimes to close my eyes with a vague desire that when I opened them I might find Apollo under the opposite tree, lazily kissing his flute, or see Diana hurrying with long steps down the ilex walk. But for the most part my host seemed to me simply an unhappy young man with a morbid mental twist which ought to be smoothed away as speedily as possible. If the remedy was to match the disease, however, it would have to be an extraordinary dose. One evening, having bidden my goddaughter a good night, I started on my usual walk to my lodgings in the Corso. 5 minutes after leaving the villa gate, I discovered that I had left my eyeglass, an object in constant use, behind me. I immediately remembered that while painting I had broken the string which fastened it round my neck, and had hooked it provisionally upon the twig of a flowering almond which happened to be near me. Shortly afterwards I had gathered up my things and retired, unmindful of the glass, and now, as I needed it to read the evening paper at the Café Greco, there was no alternative but to retrace my steps and detach it from its twig. I easily found it, and lingered a while to note the curious night aspect of the spot I had been studying by daylight. The night was magnificent and full charged with the breath of the early Roman spring. The moon was rising fast and flinging her silver chequers into the heavy masses of shadow. Watching her at work, I strolled farther and suddenly came in sight of the casino. Just then the moon, which for a moment had been concealed, touched with a white ray a small marble figure which adorned the pediment of this rather factitious little structure. The way it leaped into prominence suggested that a rarer spectacle was at hand, and that the same influence must be vastly becoming to the imprisoned Juno. The door of the casino was, as usual, locked, but the moonlight flooded the high-placed window so generously that my curiosity became obstinate and inventive. I dragged a garden seat round from the portico, placed it on end, and succeeded in climbing to the top of it and bringing myself abreast of one of the windows. The casement yielded to my pressure, turned on its hinges, and showed me what I had been looking for, a transfiguration. The beautiful image stood bathed in the cold radiance, shining with a purity that made her convincingly divine. If by day her rich paleness suggested faded gold, she now had a complexion like silver slightly dimmed. The effect was almost terrible. Beauty so expressive could hardly be inanimate. This was my foremost observation. I leave you to fancy whether my next was less interesting. At some distance from the foot of the statue, just out of the light, I perceived a figure lying flat on the pavement, prostrate apparently with devotion. I can hardly tell you how it completed the impressiveness of the scene. It marked the shining image as a goddess indeed, and seemed to throw a sort of conscious pride into her stony mask. Of course, in this recumbent worshipper I immediately recognized the Count, and while I lingered there, as if to help me to read the full meaning of his attitude, the moonlight travelled forward and covered his breast and face. Then I saw that his eyes were closed, and that he was either asleep or swooning. Watching him attentively, I perceived his even respirations, and judged there was no reason for alarm. The moonlight blanched his face, which seemed already pale with weariness. He had come into the presence of the Juno in obedience to that fabulous passion of which the symptoms had given us so much to wonder at, and exhausted either by compliance or resistance, he had sunk down at her feet in a stupid sleep. The lunar influence soon roused him, however. He muttered something and raised himself, vaguely staring. Then, recognizing his situation, he rose and stood for some time gazing fixedly at the brilliant image, with an expression which I suspected was not that of wholly unprotesting devotion. He uttered a string of broken words, of which I was unable to catch the meaning, and then, after another pause, and a long and melancholy moan, he turned slowly to the door. As rapidly and noiselessly as possible, I descended from my post of vigilance, and passed behind the casino, and in a moment I heard the sound of the closing lock and the departing footsteps. The next day, meeting in the garden the functionary who had conducted the excavation, I shook my finger at him with an intention of portentous gravity, but he only grinned like the malicious earth gnome to which I had always compared him, and twisted his moustache as if my menace were a capital joke. "If you dig any more holes here," I said, "you shall be thrust into the deepest of them, and have the earth packed down on top of you. We have made enough discoveries, and we want no more statues. Your Juno has almost ruined us." He burst out laughing. "I expected as much. I had my notion." "What was your notion?" "That the Signor Conte would begin and say his prayers to her." "Good heavens! Is the case so common? Why did you expect it?" On the contrary, the case is rare, but I have fumbled so long in the monstrous heritage of antiquity that I have learned a multitude of secrets, learned that ancient relics may work modern miracles. There is a pagan element in all of us. I don't speak for you, illustrissimi forestieri, and the old gods have still their worshippers. The old spirit still throbs here and there, and the Signor Conte has his share of it. He's a good fellow, but between ourselves, he's an impossible Christian." And this singular personage resumed his impertinent hilarity. "If your provisions were so distinct, you ought to have given me a hint of them," I said. "I should have sent your spadesman walking." "Ah, but the Juno is so beautiful." "Her beauty be blasted! Can you tell me what has become of the Comtesses? To rival the Juno she is turning to marble herself." He shrugged his shoulders. "Ah, but the Juno is worth 50,000 scudi." "I would give 100,000 to have her annihilated. Perhaps, after all, I shall want you to dig another hole." "At your service," he answered with a flourish, while I turned my back on him. A couple of days later I dined, as I often did, with my host and hostess, and met the Count face to face for the first time since his prostration in the Casino. He bore the traces of it, and was uncommonly taciturn and absent. It appeared to me that the path of the antique faith was not strewn with flowers, and that the Juno was becoming daily a harder mistress to serve. Dinner was scarcely over before he rose from table and took up his hat. As he did so, passing near his wife, he faltered a moment, stopped and gave her, for the first time I imagine, that vaguely imploring look which I myself had often caught. She moved her lips in inarticulate sympathy and put out her hands. He drew her towards him, kissed her with an almost brutal violence, and strode away. The occasion was propitious, and further delay unnecessary. "What I have to tell you is very strange," I said to the Countess, "very improbable, very incredible. But perhaps you will not find it so bad as you feared. There is a woman in the case. Your enemy is the Juno. The Count, how shall I say it? The Count takes her au sérieux." She was silent, but after a moment she touched my arm with her hand, and I knew she meant that I had spoken her own belief. "You admired his antique simplicity? You see how far it goes. He has reverted to the faith of his fathers. Dormant for so many centuries, that imperious image has silently evoked it. He believes in the pedigrees you used to dog's ear your school mythology with, trying to get by heart. In a word, dear child, Marco is an anthropomorphist. Do you know what that means?" "I suppose you will be terribly shocked," she answered, "if I say that he is welcome to any faith if he will only share it with me. I will believe in Jupiter if he'll bid me. My sorrow is not for that. Let my husband be himself. My sorrow is for the gulf of silence and indifference that has opened itself between us. His Juno is the reality. I am the fiction." I have lately become reconciled to this gulf of silence, and to your losing for a while your importance. After the fable, the moral. The poor fellow has but half succumbed. The other half protests. The modern man is shut out in the darkness with his irreproachable wife. How can he have failed to feel, vaguely and grossly, if it must have been, but in every throb of his heart, that you are a more perfect experiment of nature, a riper fruit of time, than those primitive persons for whom Juno was a terror and Venus a model? He pays you the compliment of believing you an unconvertible modern. He has crossed the Acheron, but he has left you behind as a pledge to the present. We will bring him back to redeem it. The old ancestral ghosts ought to be propitiated when a pretty creature like you has sacrificed the best elements of her life. He has proved himself one of the Valerii. We shall see to it that he is the last, and yet that his passing away shall leave the Conte Marco in excellent health." I spoke with confidence, and partly felt it, for it seemed to me that if the Count was to be touched, it must be by the sense that his strange spiritual excursion had not made his wife detest him. We talked long and to a hopeful end, for before I went away my goddaughter expressed the desire to go out and look at the Juno. "I was afraid of her almost from the first," she said. and have hardly seen her since she was set up in the casino. Perhaps I can learn a lesson from her. Perhaps I can guess how she charms him." For a moment I hesitated, from the fear that we might intrude upon the Count's devotions. Then, as something in the poor girl's face suggested that she too had thought of this, and felt a sudden impulse to pluck victory from the heart of danger, I bravely offered her my arm. The night was cloudy, and on this occasion apparently the triumphant goddess was to depend upon her own lustre. But as we approached the casino I saw that the door was ajar, and that there was lamplight within. The lamp was suspended in front of the image, and it showed us that the place was empty, but evidently the Count had lately been there. Before the statue stood a roughly extemporized altar, composed of a shapeless fragment of antique marble, engraved with an illegible Greek inscription. We seemed really to stand in a pagan temple, and as we gazed at the serene divinity, I think we each of us felt for a moment the breath of superstition. It ought to have been quickened, I suppose, but it was rudely arrested by our observing a curious glitter on the face of the low altar. A second glance showed us it was blood. My companion looked at me in pale horror, and turned away with a cry. A swarm of hideous conjectures pressed into my mind, and for a moment I was sickened. But at last I remembered that there is blood, and that in the best time the ancient Romans offered no human victims. "Be sure it's very innocent," I said. "A lamb, a kid, or a sucking calf." But it was enough for her nerves and her conscience that it was a crimson trickle, and she returned to the house in immense agitation. The rest of the night was not passed in a way to restore her to calmness. The Count had not come in, and she sat up for him from hour to hour. I remained with her, smoking my cigar as composedly as I might, but internally I wondered what in horror's name had become of him. Gradually, as the hours wore away, I arrived at a vague interpretation of these strange practices, an interpretation none the less valid and less welcome for being comparatively cheerful. The blood drops on the altar, I mused, were the last instalment of his debt and the end of his delusion. They had been a happy necessity, for he was, after all, too generous a creature not to hate himself for having shed them, not to abhor so cruelly insistent an idol. He had wandered away to recover himself in solitude, and he would come back to us with a repentant heart and an inquiring mind. I should certainly have believed all this more easily, however, if I could have heard his footstep in the hall. Toward dawn scepticism threatened to creep in with the grey light, and I restlessly betook myself to the portico. Here, in a few moments, I saw him cross the grass, heavy-footed, splashed with mud, and evidently excessively tired. He must have been walking all night, and his face denoted that his spirit had been as restless as his body. He passed near me, and before he entered the house he stopped, looked at me a moment, and then held out his hand. I grasped it warmly, and it seemed to me to throb with all that he was unable to utter. "Will you see your wife?" I asked. He passed his hand over his eyes and shook his head. "Not now, not yet, sometime," he answered. I was disappointed, but I convinced her, I think, that he had cast out the devil. She felt, poor girl, a pardonable desire to celebrate the event. I returned to my lodging, spent the day in Rome, and came back to the villa toward dusk. I was told that the Countess was in the grounds. I looked for her cautiously at first, for I thought it just possible I might intrude upon the natural consequences of a reconciliation, but failing to meet her I turned toward the casino, and found myself face to face with the mocking little commissioner. "Does your Excellency happen to have 20 yards of stout rope about him?" he asked gravely. "Do you want to hang yourself for the trouble you have stood sponsor to?" I answered. "It's a hanging matter, I promise you. The Countess has given orders. You will find her in the casino. Sweet-voiced as she is, she knows how to make her orders understood." At the door of the casino stood half a dozen of the labourers on the place, looking vaguely solemn, like outstanding dependents at a superior funeral. The Countess was within, in a position which was an answer to the surveyor's riddle. She stood with her eyes fixed on the Juno, who had been removed from her pedestal and lay stretched in her magnificent length upon a rude litter. "Do you understand?" she said. "She's beautiful, she's noble, she's precious, but she must go back." And with a passionate gesture she seemed to represent an open grave. I was hugely delighted, but I thought it discreet to stroke my chin and look scrupulous. "She is worth 50,000 scudi." She shook her head sadly. "If we were to sell her to the Pope and give the money to the poor, it wouldn't profit us. She must go back, she must go back. We must smother her beauty in the dreadful earth. It makes me feel almost as if she were alive, but it came to me last night with overwhelming force when my husband came in and refused to see me, that he will not be himself so long as she is above ground. To cut the knot we must bury her. If I had only thought of it before." "Not before," I said, shaking my head in turn. "Heaven reward our sacrifice now." The little expert, when he reappeared, seemed hardly like an agent of the celestial influences, but he was deft and active, which was more to the point. Every now and then he uttered some half-articulate lament by way of protest against the Countess's cruelty, but I saw him privately scanning the recumbent image with an eye which seemed to foresee a malicious glee in standing on a certain unmarked spot on the turf and grinning till people stared. He had brought back an abundance of rope, and having summoned his assistants who vigorously lifted the litter, he led the way to the original excavation which had been left unclosed owing to the project of further researches. By the time we reached the edge of the grave, the evening had fallen, and the beauty of our marble victim was shrouded in a dusky veil. No one spoke, if not exactly for shame, at least for regret. Whatever our plea, our performance looked, at least, monstrously profane. The ropes were adjusted, and the Juno was slowly lowered into her earthy bed. The Countess took a handful of earth and dropped it solemnly on her breast. "May it lie lightly, but for ever," she said. "Amen," cried the little surveyor, with a strange sneering inflection, and he gave us a bow as he departed, which betrayed an agreeable consciousness of knowing where 50,000 scudi were buried. His underlings had another cask of wine, the result of which, for them, was a suspension of all consciousness and a subsequent irreparable confusion of memory as to where they had plied their spades. The Countess had not yet seen her husband, who had again apparently betaken himself to communion with the great god Pan. I was of course unwilling to leave her to encounter alone the results of her momentous deed. She wandered into the drawing-room and pretended to occupy herself with a bit of embroidery, but in reality she was bravely composing herself for an explanation. I took up a book, but it held my attention as feebly. As the evening wore away, I heard a movement on the threshold, and saw the Count lifting the tapestried curtain which masked the door, and looking silently at his wife. His eyes were brilliant, but not angry. He had missed the Juno, and drawn a long breath. The Countess kept her eyes fixed on her work, and drew her silken threads like an image of domestic tranquillity. The image seemed to fascinate him. He came in slowly, almost on tiptoe, walked to the chimney-piece, and stood there a while, giving her, askance, an immense deal of attention. What had passed, what was passing in his mind, I leave to your own apprehension. My goddaughter's hand trembled as it rose and fell, and the colour came into her cheek. At last she raised her eyes, and sustained the gaze in which all his returning faith seemed concentrated. He hesitated for a moment, as if her very forgiveness kept the gulf open between them, and then he strode forward, fell on his 2 knees, and buried his head in her lap. I departed as the Count had come in, on tiptoe. He never became, if you will, a thoroughly modern man, but one day, years after, when a visitor to whom he was showing his cabinet became inquisitive as to a marble hand suspended in one of its inner recesses, he looked grave and turned the lock on it. "It is the hand of a beautiful creature," he said, "whom I once greatly admired." "Ah! a Roman?" asked the gentleman with a smirk. "A Greek," said the count with a frown. End of Project Gutenberg of The Last of the Valerii, by Henry James.